Racist cop's career ends after encounter with influential black woman. In this gripping video, we delve into the remarkable story of how a routine encounter with an influential black woman led to the end of a racist cop's career. This incident serves as a stark reminder of the power individuals have to drive change and demand accountability within law enforcement. Watch as we uncover the details of this pivotal interaction and its profound impact on the community. If you are enthusiastic about this narrative, please inform us. If you appreciated the video, press 1. If not, select 0. Your feedback genuinely motivates me to collect additional uplifting and significant narratives.
The Grand City Library stood as a testament to both time and knowledge. Located in the heart of the city, its towering stone columns and Gothic architecture gave it an almost mystical aura. Though usually bustling with students, researchers, and curious visitors during the day, tonight the atmosphere was different. The library was eerily quiet, its usual crowd replaced by a select group of legal professionals who had gathered for a private, high-profile conference. The topic of the night: judicial reforms, and how they could reshape the future of the legal system. Inside the dimly lit halls of the library, in a room deep within the archives, sat Amanda Jacobs, a woman of sharp intellect and undeniable charisma. She was no stranger to rooms like these. As a skilled attorney and the daughter of Judge Thomas Jacobs, one of the most influential legal minds in the country, Amanda was often surrounded by those who sought to reshape society through law. Tonight was no different. The room Amanda found herself in was not just any room, it was the restricted archive section of the library, accessible only to a few elite members of society. Rows upon rows of leather-bound legal manuscripts lined the walls, each containing the history of laws passed, repealed, and contested over centuries. The musty smell of old paper filled the air, adding to the solemnity of the evening. Muffled conversations could be heard from other parts of the library, where judges, attorneys, and legal scholars exchanged ideas and debated the finer points of justice. Amanda was seated at a large oak table in the center of the room, her hands resting lightly on a stack of documents. Her sharp eyes scanned the pages before her, occasionally flicking up to glance at the other attendees. She recognized a few of the faces from previous legal events, but most of them were older men, her father's contemporaries, powerful figures in the world of law. Amanda, though younger, had earned her place among them through her tenacity and talent. The meeting was running late, which was not uncommon for discussions of such magnitude. The conversation had already covered numerous topics: reforming sentencing guidelines, revising outdated legal practices, and tackling corruption within the system. Amanda, while listening intently, felt the familiar stirrings of frustration. She had heard these discussions many times before, roundtable talks that often led to little action. Tonight, however, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, a sense that change was not only possible but imminent. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered. It was subtle at first, but then the flicker became more pronounced, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the attendees. Amanda frowned slightly, glancing up at the dimming chandelier that hung above them. She could see a few of the other lawyers exchanging uneasy glances, their conversation faltering as the flickering continued. The lights blinked a few more times before stabilizing, but the brief disruption had shifted the mood in the room. "Must be the old wiring in this place," one of the attendees, an elderly judge, muttered under his breath, trying to lighten the tension. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The library, despite its age, was meticulously maintained, especially in areas where important events like this were held. A malfunction like this seemed out of place. As if in response to her thoughts, the fire alarm suddenly blared, the shrill sound echoing off the high ceilings. Everyone in the room jumped, startled by the sudden noise. For a moment there was confusion as people looked at one another, unsure of what was happening. Amanda stood up quickly, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "Is this real?" one of the attorneys asked, his voice strained with disbelief. "A fire drill at this hour?" "It doesn't sound like a drill," Amanda replied, her voice calm but firm. She had been in enough situations to recognize the difference between a planned evacuation and a genuine emergency. Before anyone could respond, a librarian rushed into the room, her face pale and anxious. "I'm sorry, but we need to evacuate the building immediately," she said, her voice slightly trembling. "There seems to be a malfunction in the security system, and we can't take any chances. Please follow the marked exits." The room erupted into motion as the lawyers and judges hurried to gather their belongings. Amanda remained composed, but her mind was racing. Something about this felt off. Malfunction or not, the timing of this incident during such a critical meeting was suspicious. As the group began filing out of the room, Amanda found herself lagging behind. She wasn't one to panic, and her instincts told her that there was more to this than a simple system failure. She quickly gathered her notes and documents, slipping them into her leather briefcase before making her way to the door. The library's corridors, usually quiet and serene, were now filled with the sounds of hurried footsteps and the incessant wail of the alarm. Following the directions of the library staff, Amanda and the others were led toward the main exit. However, as the group reached the large, ornate front doors, they found themselves greeted by locked gates. The security system had triggered an automatic lockdown, sealing the exits. Confusion turned to frustration as people began murmuring among themselves. "This is ridiculous," one of the judges grumbled. "Can't someone turn this damn alarm off?" "Looks like we'll have to wait until they sort it out," another added, clearly irritated by the inconvenience. But Amanda wasn't one to wait around. As the crowd became more restless, she discreetly slipped away from the group, her eyes scanning the walls for another way out. She knew the layout of the library well, having spent countless hours here as both a student and a professional. There was a service exit at the back of the building, reserved for staff and deliveries. It was rarely used, but in this situation it seemed like the best option. Navigating her way through the dimly lit corridors, Amanda moved quickly but quietly. The wailing alarm and flickering lights added to the surreal nature of the night, but she kept her focus. She reached the service exit without incident, pushing open the heavy metal door. The cool night air greeted her as she stepped outside into a narrow alley behind the library. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the faint sounds of the city in the distance contrasted sharply with the tense quiet of the alleyway. Just as she was about to make her way to the street, Amanda heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. She turned quickly, her heart pounding in her chest, and saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Officer Mark Reynolds, a patrol cop who had been transferred to an administrative role after a series of misconduct allegations. He was not supposed to be here. Reynolds approached her with an unsettling look in his eyes, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. "This area's off limits." Amanda straightened her posture, meeting his gaze. "I'm leaving the library," she replied firmly. "There's a security malfunction, and we were told to evacuate." Reynolds didn't move. He studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here," he muttered, taking a step closer. "What were you doing inside?" Amanda's pulse quickened, but she didn't waver. "I was attending a private conference. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get home." Reynolds blocked her path, his posture growing more aggressive. "I don't think so. You're coming with me." Officer Mark Reynolds stood in the alley, his stance aggressive, his face stern. The dim glow of the nearby streetlights cast long shadows on the damp ground beneath his feet, and his hand lingered near the grip of his holstered gun, as though he expected trouble. Amanda, still composed but acutely aware of the tense situation, knew this confrontation could escalate quickly if she didn't handle it carefully. "Officer, I've already explained," Amanda said in an even tone, trying to diffuse the tension. "There's been a malfunction with the library's security system. We were evacuated, and I'm simply trying to get home." Reynolds, however, was not listening. His eyes darted between Amanda's face and the leather briefcase she held in her hand, as though trying to piece together some imagined crime. There was a glint of suspicion in his eyes, but it went deeper than that. It was the kind of suspicion born not out of facts but out of prejudice. Amanda could feel it. She had experienced this before, but tonight, standing alone in the alley with this cop, the stakes felt much higher. "You think I'm stupid?" Reynolds growled, taking a step closer, his breath hot and sour in the cold night air. "I see what's going on here. Some high and mighty lawyer sneaking out of a closed library, carrying a briefcase like you've got something to hide. You're not fooling anyone." Amanda's heart began to race, but outwardly she remained calm. Her years of legal training had prepared her for hostile interactions. But this was different. This was not a courtroom, and Reynolds didn't seem to care about the law. He was on a power trip, and she knew she had to tread carefully. "I'm not sneaking out of anywhere," Officer Amanda replied, keeping her voice level. "I'm simply leaving as instructed. If you'll allow me to pass, I'd appreciate it." But Reynolds wasn't interested in letting her go. In his mind, he had already decided that Amanda was guilty of something. What exactly, he wasn't sure, but that didn't matter. His entire career had been built on making assumptions, and tonight he was eager to assert his authority, especially over someone who seemed to challenge it just by existing. "Let me see what's in the briefcase," he demanded suddenly, pointing at the case in her hand. Amanda hesitated. The briefcase contained sensitive legal documents from the meeting, confidential files that were not meant to be seen by anyone outside of the conference. She knew that showing him the contents could have serious implications, but refusing could make the situation worse. "These are legal documents," Amanda said, standing her ground. "I'm afraid I can't show them to you without proper cause. If you believe I've committed a crime, you can arrest me, but I won't hand over my briefcase without a warrant." Reynolds' eyes darkened. He wasn't used to people standing up to him, especially not in situations like this. The fact that Amanda knew her rights only made him angrier, as though her knowledge of the law was a direct challenge to his authority. "I don't need a warrant when I've got probable cause," Reynolds snapped, taking another step toward her. "And you're giving me plenty of reasons to be suspicious." Amanda felt her grip tighten on the handle of the briefcase. She knew how this worked. Cops like Reynolds thrived on intimidation, hoping to make people nervous enough to slip up, to give them an excuse to escalate. She wasn't about to fall into that trap. "Officer, if you believe you have probable cause, then you're welcome to arrest me," Amanda said, her voice steady but firm. "But if you lay a hand on me without justification, I will ensure that you face the consequences of your actions." For a moment there was silence. The tension between them was thick, and Amanda could feel her pulse pounding in her temples. She knew she was playing a dangerous game by challenging him, but she also knew that backing down would only embolden him. Reynolds' face twitched with barely contained rage. He was used to people complying, to using his badge as a weapon of intimidation. But here was this woman, standing firm in the face of his authority, daring to speak to him as though they were equals. "Don't you dare threaten me," Reynolds hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You think you can talk to me like that and just walk away?" and then, without warning, he grabbed her arm hard. The suddenness of the movement caught Amanda off guard. Pain shot through her arm as his fingers dug into her flesh, but she didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her breath quickening but her expression remaining stoic. The alley felt smaller now, the walls closing in as Reynolds tightened his grip. "Officer, let go of me," Amanda said, her voice sharper now, but still controlled. Reynolds didn't let go. Instead, he yanked her closer, his face inches from hers, his eyes wild with anger. "I'll decide when you get to leave," he snarled. "You're not going anywhere until I'm done with you." And then, before Amanda could react, he slapped her. The blow came fast and hard, the sound echoing through the narrow alley like a crack of thunder. Amanda's head snapped to the side, the sting spreading across her cheek. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Amanda didn't move, didn't speak. The only sound was the distant hum of the city beyond the alleyway, indifferent to the violence that had just occurred. Reynolds, breathing heavily, took a step back. His hand trembled slightly as though even he hadn't expected to take it that far. But the deed was done. He had crossed a line, and they both knew it. Amanda slowly straightened, her face throbbing from the impact. She turned to face him, her eyes blazing with a quiet fury. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career," she said, her voice cold as steel. Reynolds' face twisted in defiance, but there was something else there too: fear. He wasn't afraid of Amanda herself, he was afraid of what she represented. He had just attacked someone with connections, someone who wasn't going to quietly back down. And now, for the first time, he realized the gravity of his actions. "Shut up," he spat, though his voice lacked the same conviction as before. "You're coming with me." He reached for his handcuffs, but before he could snap them onto her wrists, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the alley. Both Amanda and Reynolds turned toward the sound, and out of the shadows emerged another figure, a young police officer, clearly out of breath and with wide, nervous eyes. It was Officer Thomas, a recent transfer to Reynolds' unit. He had been on patrol nearby when he overheard the commotion and decided to investigate. What he found, however, was far more than he had anticipated. As he approached, his gaze flicked between Amanda, standing tall with a red mark blooming across her cheek, and Reynolds, whose hand still hovered near his gun. "Reynolds," Thomas said, his voice uncertain. "What's going on here?" Reynolds stiffened, his expression shifting into one of irritation. "Nothing you need to worry about, rookie," he snapped. "Go back to your patrol." But Thomas didn't move. He could sense that something was very wrong. The tension in the air, the look on Amanda's face, it all screamed that whatever had just happened was far from routine. Thomas wasn't naive. He had heard rumors about Reynolds, about his temper and his methods. But seeing it firsthand was something else entirely. "Reynolds, maybe we should call this in," Thomas suggested carefully. "It looks like there's been some misunderstanding." Reynolds shot him a glare that could have cut through steel. "I said, go back to your patrol," he growled. "I've got this under control." But Thomas hesitated. His eyes met Amanda's, and in that moment he saw something that made him pause. He saw someone who wasn't just another citizen being harassed by an overzealous cop. He saw someone with power, someone who wasn't going to let this slide. And more than that, he saw someone who was right. "Reynolds," Thomas said, more firmly this time, "I think you've gone too far." Reynolds' face flushed a deep red as Officer Thomas' words hung in the air. His grip on Amanda's arm tightened, and the tension between them reached a fever pitch. Thomas stood a few feet away, still catching his breath, his wide eyes betraying the conflict brewing inside him. He was young, new to the force, and had never seen anything like this up close. His mind raced as he tried to assess the situation, but it was clear something had gone very, very wrong. Amanda felt the vice-like pressure on her arm increase, but she kept her gaze locked on Reynolds. She didn't back down, not even a flinch, despite the sharp pain radiating from the spot where he had struck her. Her face, still stinging from the slap, burned not only from the impact but from the indignity of it all. But Amanda wasn't just a victim, she was a fighter. She had spent her entire career standing up to people like Reynolds, people who thought power gave them the right to control others. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her, not now, not ever. "Let her go," Reynolds Thomas said again, this time more forcefully, though his voice wavered slightly. It was a direct order, and it wasn't lost on either Reynolds or Amanda that Thomas was stepping far out of line to make such a demand. Rookie cops didn't challenge their superiors like this, especially not someone with Reynolds' reputation. Reynolds' head snapped toward Thomas, and his eyes flared with anger. His grip on Amanda's arm finally loosened, though he didn't let go completely. He was balancing on the precipice of an explosion, and everyone in the alley could feel it. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Rookie Reynolds spat, taking a step toward Thomas while still holding on to Amanda. "You don't give me orders. I've been doing this job longer than you've been alive. I've got this situation under control, and you're going to get the hell out of here before you make things worse." Thomas hesitated, swallowing hard. He knew he was stepping into dangerous territory. Reynolds wasn't just any cop, he was someone with a reputation for pushing things too far, and everyone knew it. The rumors that floated around the precinct about Reynolds' past misconduct, his tendency to escalate minor situations into violent confrontations, all came rushing back into Thomas' mind. He had only been on the job for a few months, but even he had heard the whispers. But what he saw in front of him wasn't a rumor, it was real. Amanda, with her sharp eyes and bruised cheek, stood before him as living proof that Reynolds had gone too far. Thomas had never been in this kind of situation before, but his instincts told him that if he didn't step in now, things were going to spiral completely out of control. Reynolds Thomas said, forcing himself to stay calm. "This isn't right. She hasn't done anything wrong. You can't just..." Reynolds' face twisted into a sneer. "Oh, she hasn't done anything wrong." His voice was laced with sarcasm and venom. "You don't know anything, rookie. This woman, she's hiding something. I can feel it. She's sneaking out of a closed building in the middle of the night, carrying a briefcase full of God knows what, and now she's mouthing off like she's above the law. You think she's innocent?" Thomas looked at Amanda again. She wasn't mouthing off, she was defending herself. And more than that, she was standing firm, refusing to let Reynolds intimidate her. Thomas could see it in her eyes. She was someone who knew the law better than most, and she wasn't going to let someone like Reynolds abuse his power unchecked. "I don't think that gives you the right to hit her," Thomas replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Reynolds stiffened. His hand finally released Amanda's arm, and he took another menacing step toward Thomas, squaring up to the younger officer. He was bigger, stronger, and had years of experience under his belt, experience that had taught him to bend the rules and get away with it. He loomed over Thomas, his face inches away, his breath hot and sour. "You don't know what the hell you're talking about," Reynolds snarled. "You don't know how this works out here." "I do. This isn't some textbook scenario, kid. This is real life. And out here, people like her don't play by the rules." Amanda's eyes flashed with anger at Reynolds' words, but she remained silent. She could sense that this was about more than just her now. This was about a power struggle between the officers. She watched as Thomas took a step back, his face conflicted, but he didn't retreat completely. He was scared Amanda could see that, but he wasn't backing down entirely. "Reynolds, I'm not going to let this slide," Thomas said, his voice shaky but determined. "You've crossed the line." Reynolds chuckled darkly, his body tense with barely controlled rage. "You're really trying to play hero here, aren't you, rookie?" He shook his head, almost laughing at the absurdity of it. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. The alley, illuminated only by the weak flicker of a distant streetlight, felt claustrophobic. The city seemed far away now, as if the world had narrowed down to just the three of them, Amanda, Reynolds and Thomas, locked in a standoff that was growing more dangerous by the second. And then, without warning, Reynolds' hand shot out. He grabbed Thomas by the collar of his uniform and shoved him hard against the brick wall of the alley. The impact was brutal, and Thomas let out a pained grunt as the back of his head collided with the stone. Amanda gasped, instinctively stepping forward, but Reynolds was faster. He turned on her, his eyes wild, and jabbed a finger in her direction. "Stay where you are," he barked. His voice echoed through the narrow alley, loud and commanding. Amanda froze, but her mind was racing. She had to find a way out of this situation, and fast. Reynolds was completely out of control now, and it was only a matter of time before things got even worse. She glanced toward the entrance of the alley, calculating the distance. She could try to run, but that would only escalate things further. No, she needed to stay calm, find a way to reason with Thomas, get him to call for backup. But Thomas, dazed from the blow, was still pinned against the wall by Reynolds' powerful grip. The rookie's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock and fear. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Reynolds to turn on him like this. "Reynolds, stop!" Thomas gasped, his voice barely audible through the pain. This isn't right." But Reynolds wasn't listening. His grip on Thomas' collar tightened, and his other hand hovered dangerously close to his gun. "You think you can come in here and undermine me?" Rookie Reynolds hissed. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job. You don't get to question my authority." Thomas winced, trying to pull himself free, but Reynolds held him firmly in place. Amanda could see the panic rising in Thomas' eyes, the realization that he was completely at Reynolds' mercy. "Let him go, Reynolds," Amanda said, her voice low and controlled. She knew she had to be careful. One wrong word, and Reynolds could snap. "This has gone too far. You're making a mistake." Reynolds turned to her, his eyes flashing with fury. "You shut your mouth," he growled. "This is your fault. You think you can just walk out of here after everything that's happened? You're coming with me, and that's final." Amanda took a deep breath. She had to stay calm. She couldn't let his words get to her, no matter how hard it was. She knew she needed to keep the situation from spiraling even further. "Reynolds, listen to me," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I know this has gotten out of hand, but you still have a chance to fix it. Let Officer Thomas go. Let me go. We can walk away from this before things get worse." For a brief moment, something flickered in Reynolds' eyes, something that looked like doubt. But it was quickly replaced by the same burning anger that had driven him all along. "You think I'm going to walk away from this?" he spat. "You think I'm just going to let you get away with whatever you're doing here?" Amanda clenched her fists. "I'm not getting away with anything. I haven't done anything wrong." But Reynolds wasn't listening. He was too far gone now, too consumed by the need to assert his dominance, to prove that he was still in control. He yanked Thomas forward, pulling the rookie off the wall and throwing him roughly to the ground. Thomas hit the pavement with a thud, groaning in pain. "Stay down," Rookie Reynolds snapped, standing over him. "Maybe you'll learn something from this." Amanda's pulse quickened. This was it, things were about to reach a breaking point. She had to act, and she had to act now. Before she could make a move, however, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the alley. Amanda's heart skipped a beat. Backup. Someone had heard the commotion. Relief washed over her, but it was fleeting. The situation was still volatile, and Reynolds, in his rage, might do something reckless before help arrived. Two more figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, both officers from the same precinct as Reynolds and Thomas. They slowed as they approached, taking in the scene in front of them. Thomas, lying on the ground, clearly hurt. Amanda, standing frozen with a red mark on her cheek, and Reynolds, looming over them, his hand still hovering near his gun. Reynolds, one of the officers, called out cautiously, "What the hell's going on here?" Reynolds didn't turn to face them. His jaw clenched, his knuckles white as he balled his fists at his sides. He was teetering on the edge, and everyone could feel it. "This doesn't concern you," Reynolds said through gritted teeth. "I've got it under control." But the new arrivals didn't seem convinced. The officer who had spoken, a man in his late 30s named Harris, exchanged a look with his partner before stepping forward. "Doesn't look like you've got it under control," Harris said, his tone measured but firm. "Maybe you should step back." Reynolds' eyes narrowed. "Don't tell me how to do my job, Harris." Harris took another step forward, his gaze shifting briefly to Amanda. He could see the situation was bad, really bad, and he knew that if Reynolds wasn't stopped, things were only going to get worse. "Let's just calm down, all right," Harris said, trying to de-escalate. "We don't need to make this into something it doesn't have to be." Reynolds was shaking now, his rage barely contained. "This isn't your call, Harris." But Harris wasn't backing down. "Reynolds, look around. This is over. You've gone too far. Don't make it worse." There was a long pause as Reynolds' eyes darted between Harris, Thomas, and Amanda. His breathing was ragged, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out again. But then, slowly, he lowered his hand from his gun. As Reynolds slowly lowered his hand from his gun, the tension in the alley didn't dissipate. It only thickened, like a storm cloud on the verge of breaking. Officer Harris and his partner stood just a few feet away, their faces taut with concern. Thomas was still on the ground, wincing as he tried to gather himself, and Amanda stood her ground, her gaze unwavering despite the stinging pain in her arm and cheek. Reynolds looked cornered, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his mind racing through possible outcomes. He had spent years pushing his authority, bending rules, and getting away with it. This wasn't the first time a situation had spiraled out of control, but tonight felt different. The presence of Amanda, a confident, educated woman who clearly wasn't afraid of him, had ignited something deep inside him, something he was losing control over. Reynolds, Harris said again, more firmly now, as if sensing his colleague's internal struggle. "Step back. Let's talk about this." Reynolds didn't move. His eyes flickered toward Amanda, his lips curling in frustration. He wanted to control this, to make sure she didn't walk away feeling like she had won. He wanted to make her understand that people like him didn't answer to people like her. But the arrival of his fellow officers complicated everything. He could feel the walls closing in on him, and it enraged him. "You think she's innocent?" Reynolds growled, gesturing toward Amanda without looking at her. "You think she's just some victim here? You don't know what I've seen. She's hiding something. I know it." Amanda didn't flinch. She had already decided that staying calm was her best weapon. She could sense that Reynolds was grasping at straws, trying to justify his behavior. But now, with more officers on the scene, she felt a small surge of hope. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about exposing Reynolds for who he truly was, and she had the law on her side. "This has nothing to do with me hiding anything," Amanda said, her voice steady but sharp. "This is about your ego and your need to feel powerful. You don't have any reason to hold me here." Reynolds' eyes flared with anger. He took a step toward her, but Harris moved quickly, placing himself between them. It was a clear signal Reynolds was no longer in control. "That's enough," Harris said, his voice low but authoritative. "Step back, Reynolds, now." Reynolds froze, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, but his instincts were fighting against the reality of the situation. He had been challenged by Amanda, by Thomas, and now by Harris. He was being backed into a corner, and the part of him that thrived on authority was rebelling. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," Harris Reynolds spat. His voice was hoarse with frustration, his body tense as though he was ready to lash out again. "You don't know what she's capable of." Harris didn't take his eyes off Reynolds. "I know what's going on here," he said firmly. "And it's over. You're done." Reynolds sneered, but the fight was draining from him. He could see it in Harris' eyes. There was no turning back. The situation had escalated beyond his control, and any further action would only make things worse. Slowly, begrudgingly, Reynolds took a step back, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. As soon as Reynolds retreated, Amanda exhaled, the tension in her body slightly easing. Harris turned toward her, his expression a mixture of concern and professionalism. "Are you all right?" he asked, keeping a careful distance, as if aware that she had already endured enough aggression for one night. Amanda nodded, her hand instinctively rising to touch her cheek where Reynolds had struck her. "I'll be fine," she said, though her voice was tight. "But this isn't over." Harris glanced between her and Reynolds, clearly understanding what she meant. "We'll deal with this," he assured her, his tone softer now. "But I need you to stay calm and cooperate. We'll make sure this is handled properly." Amanda gave a slight nod, but inside she was far from calm. This was a fight she had no intention of backing down from. Reynolds had crossed a line, and she would see to it that he was held accountable. But her thoughts weren't just on him. The presence of the other officers meant there was more at play here. She had to figure out who was on her side and who might try to cover for Reynolds. Just then, Officer Thomas, who had been silent since being shoved to the ground, spoke up. His voice was strained, but his words were clear. "Reynolds isn't going to get away with this." Harris turned to him, and for the first time since the confrontation began, Amanda saw a flicker of uncertainty in Harris' expression. It was subtle, but it was there a moment of hesitation, as though Harris was weighing his options. It was the first indication that maybe, just maybe, Harris wasn't fully in control of the situation either. "What do you mean?" Thomas Harris asked, his tone careful. Thomas, still on the ground, winced as he sat up. His face was pale, and a thin trickle of blood ran from the back of his head where it had struck the wall. He looked up at Amanda, then at Harris, and finally at Reynolds, who was still seething a few feet away. "He's done this before," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe not exactly like this, but he's crossed the line more than once. We all know it." Harris' jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Amanda watched him closely, trying to gauge his reaction. She could tell that Thomas' words had struck a nerve, but Harris was clearly trying to maintain control of the situation. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened," Is it? Amanda said, her voice cutting through the silence. She wasn't asking, it was a statement. She could see the truth in their faces, in the way Harris and his partner exchanged uneasy glances. They knew. Harris looked away for a moment, then sighed heavily. Look, we can deal with that later, he said, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was heading. Right now, we need to focus on what happened tonight. But Amanda wasn't going to let it go. What happened tonight is part of a bigger problem, she said, her voice hardening. You think Reynolds is just going to stop? You think this is an isolated incident? He's been doing this for years, hasn't he? Harris didn't answer, but the tension in his body told Amanda everything she needed to know. This wasn't just about one bad cop making a mistake. This was about a system that had allowed people like Reynolds to thrive, to abuse their power without consequence. And Harris, whether he liked it or not, was part of that system. I can't just walk away from this, Amanda continued, her voice filled with conviction. You might be able to look the other way, but I won't. Harris' expression darkened. No one's asking you to walk away, he said, his voice clipped. But if you're going to turn this into something bigger than it is, you need to be careful. Amanda narrowed her eyes. Careful, she repeated, her voice sharp. Is that a threat? Harris shook his head quickly, but the tension between them was palpable. No, of course not, he said, though his tone was defensive. But I'm telling you, this is more complicated than you think. Amanda's gaze hardened. No, it's not, she said. It's exactly what I think it is, and if you don't deal with Reynolds now, it's only going to get worse. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was oppressive, weighed down by unspoken truths and unacknowledged guilt. Harris' partner shifted uneasily, clearly uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. Thomas, still on the ground, looked between Amanda and Harris, as though trying to figure out what would happen next. Finally, Harris broke the silence. All right, he said, his voice low and resigned. Let's take this back to the station. We'll file a report, and we'll deal with it there. Amanda didn't move. She could sense that Harris was trying to control the situation, to diffuse the immediate tension without making any real promises. But she wasn't going to be pacified that easily. You're not going to cover this up, are you? Amanda asked, her voice direct. Because if you are, I'll go public with this. I'll make sure everyone knows what happened here. Harris' jaw tightened again, and for a moment, Amanda thought he might lash out. But instead, he sighed heavily and nodded. No one's covering anything up, he said, though there was a hint of frustration in his voice. We'll do this by the book. Amanda held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded. Fine, she said, but I'll be watching. As the tension in the alley began to ease, Officer Thomas finally managed to stand. He was still pale, and the back of his head was sticky with blood, but he stood tall, his eyes fixed on Reynolds. There was something in Thomas' expression that Amanda hadn't seen before, something resolute. Reynolds isn't the only one who's going to be held accountable, Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. There are others. This has been going on for too long. Amanda felt a flicker of hope. Maybe Thomas wasn't just another rookie cop caught up in a bad situation. Maybe he was the key to exposing something much bigger. She could see the determination in his eyes, the way he was no longer afraid to speak the truth. He had seen enough, and now he was ready to act. Harris glanced at Thomas, then at Reynolds, who had been silently stewing in the background. Let's go, Harris said, his voice heavy with resignation. We'll sort this out back at the station. As they began to make their way out of the alley, Amanda felt the weight of the night settle on her shoulders. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, she felt like she had allies. Thomas, and maybe even Harris, were starting to see what she had known all along: Reynolds was just the tip of the iceberg. And now the real fight was about to begin. The short walk back to the station was tense, filled with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. The police precinct wasn't far from the alley, but each step felt heavy, like marching toward an inevitable confrontation. The air was thick with a sense of impending consequences. The tension between the officers, Amanda and Reynolds, was palpable. Every moment, every sideways glance, felt like it was teetering on the edge of another explosion. As they arrived at the precinct, Amanda was struck by how ordinary the building seemed from the outside: a standard brick structure with glass doors that belied the complex web of power and corruption inside. She had been in enough police stations throughout her career to know that beneath the surface, there was always more than what met the eye. Inside, the atmosphere was no different. Officers moved about their business, some shooting curious glances toward Amanda and Reynolds as they entered, though no one stopped to ask questions. Amanda could feel the weight of their scrutiny, but it didn't faze her. She had faced far worse than curious glances in her career. But as they walked through the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Reynolds was quiet, his jaw set in a tight line as he marched forward, clearly stewing in his own rage. Harris, leading the group, kept his expression neutral, though Amanda could tell he was still processing what had happened. Officer Thomas trailed behind them, silent but determined. The rookie's face was pale, his hand absent-mindedly touching the back of his head where it had struck the wall in the alley, but his resolve had not wavered. There was no doubt in Amanda's mind that Thomas had made up his mind he wasn't going to let Reynolds off the hook. As they entered the precinct's back offices, Harris motioned for Amanda to follow him into a small, windowless room used for interviews. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow over the room. A simple metal table with 2 chairs sat in the center. Amanda walked inside and took a seat, watching as Harris closed the door behind them. Reynolds and Thomas remained outside in the hallway. Harris sat across from her, folding his hands on the table and letting out a deep breath. For the first time that night, Amanda saw the cracks in his calm exterior. His eyes were tired, and his shoulders slumped slightly, as though the weight of the evening had finally caught up with him. "Let's get this straightened out," Harris began, his voice low and even. "I need to know everything that happened in that alley, from your perspective." Amanda didn't hesitate. She recounted the events of the evening in meticulous detail, from the evacuation of the library to her confrontation with Reynolds in the alley. She described how he had escalated the situation without cause, how he had grabbed her, hit her, and threatened her. Her tone was steady and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge of determination in her words. This wasn't just about recounting facts, it was about making sure Reynolds faced consequences for his actions. As Amanda spoke, Harris listened intently, occasionally nodding but remaining silent. He took a few notes, but his expression remained unreadable. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched on for a moment, thick and oppressive. Finally, Harris spoke. "I believe you," he said simply, though his voice was tinged with something more complex: regret, perhaps, or a recognition of the larger issue at hand. Reynolds crossed a line. He's been skating on thin ice for a long time, and we all knew it. But tonight he went too far. Amanda studied his face, sensing the internal conflict within him. Harris wasn't a bad cop, at least, not in the traditional sense. But he was part of a system that protected men like Reynolds, and now he was faced with a choice: protect the status quo or do the right thing. It was a choice that Amanda knew many officers faced, and more often than not, they chose loyalty over justice. "You have to know that this isn't just about what happened tonight," Amanda said, her voice soft but firm. Reynolds isn't an isolated case. He's part of something bigger, a culture of abuse, of power unchecked. And you're part of that system, whether you want to admit it or not. Harris' face darkened, but he didn't argue. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his hands over his face as though trying to wipe away the exhaustion of the night. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost resigned. "I've been on the force a long time," Harris said, his gaze distant. "Long enough to know that things aren't as black and white as you'd like to think. There's a lot of grey in this job, a lot of things that don't make sense unless you're in the thick of it. But you're right, Reynolds. He's been out of control for a while, and the truth is, we should have dealt with him a long time ago." Amanda felt a flicker of hope at his words, but she didn't let it show. "Then let's deal with him now," she said. "He assaulted me. He assaulted his own colleague. This isn't just about one bad night, it's about a pattern of behavior that's been ignored for too long." Harris didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the door, where Reynolds and Thomas were waiting outside. The silence between them grew heavy, laden with unspoken truths and years of buried misconduct. Amanda knew that this was the moment of reckoning, not just for Reynolds, but for Harris as well. "You're right," Harris said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "But it's not as simple as you think. There are complications." Amanda's eyes narrowed. "Complications?" Harris leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Reynolds isn't the only one involved in this. There are others, officers, higher-ups who've covered for him. If we take him down, it's going to expose a lot of people who've been part of this department for a long time." Amanda's pulse quickened. She had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. This wasn't just about Reynolds anymore, this was about a system-wide cover-up, a web of corruption that stretched far beyond one rogue cop.
"Then we expose them all," Amanda said, her voice unwavering.
Harris shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's not that easy. You don't know what you're dealing with here. The people who've been covering for Reynolds, they're powerful. They've got connections, and they won't go down without a fight." Amanda's heart raced, but she didn't back down. "I don't care how powerful they are," she said. "This ends tonight." Harris studied her for a long moment, his expression conflicted. Finally, he sighed, pushing back his chair and standing up. "All right," he said, his voice resigned. "But I hope you're ready for what's coming next." As Harris walked toward the door, Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. She had known from the beginning that this fight wouldn't be easy, but now, with the full weight of the corruption within the department looming before her, the stakes felt higher than ever. The door creaked open, and Reynolds and Thomas stood just outside, waiting. Reynolds' face was still twisted with anger, but there was something else in his eyes now, fear. He knew, just as Amanda did, that his time was running out. But there was still a dangerous edge to him, a sense that he wasn't going to go down quietly. "We're taking you into custody," Harris said, his voice flat as he addressed Reynolds. "You'll be booked for assault and misconduct. We'll sort out the rest later." Reynolds' face darkened, but he didn't resist. He stood there, silent and brooding, as Harris motioned for one of the officers nearby to take him into custody. But as they began to move, Reynolds' eyes locked onto Amanda's, and she saw the malice in his gaze. "You think you've won?" Reynolds sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into. This isn't over." Amanda met his gaze, unflinching. "You're right," she said. "It's not over. But it will be for you." Reynolds was led away in handcuffs, his shoulders tense with barely contained rage. As he disappeared down the hallway, Amanda exhaled, the tension in her body finally easing. But even as she watched him go, she knew that Reynolds was only the beginning. The web of corruption that Harris had hinted at stretched far deeper than she had realized, and now she was at the center of it. Thomas stepped forward, his face still pale but determined. "What now?" he asked quietly. Amanda glanced at Harris, who had crossed his arms, his expression weary but resolute. "Now we do it by the book," Harris said. "We take Reynolds down, and we go after everyone who covered for him." Amanda nodded, though her mind was already racing ahead. Taking down Reynolds was the first step, but it wouldn't be enough. The department was rotten to the core, and if she wanted to expose the full extent of the corruption, she would need more than just a single arrest. She would need evidence, real, irrefutable proof that the system had been compromised. "We'll need to get into the internal files," Amanda said, her voice steady but firm. "The reports, the complaints, everything that's been buried." Harris hesitated, his gaze flickering toward Thomas. "That's not going to be easy," he said. "The people who've been covering for Reynolds, they're not going to let those files see the light of day." "We don't need them to let us," Amanda replied. "We just need access." Thomas stepped forward, his expression resolute. "I can help with that," he said quietly. "I know where the files are. I've seen them, complaints, reports that never went anywhere. They're all locked away in the Internal Affairs office." Amanda's pulse quickened. "Can you get us in?" Thomas nodded, though his expression was tense. "It won't be easy. But if we're going to take down Reynolds and everyone who's protected him, we'll need those files." Harris glanced between them, his expression conflicted. He knew that what they were planning was risky, bordering on illegal, but he also knew that it might be their only shot at exposing the truth. "All right," Harris said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. "Let's do it." Hours later, as the precinct began to quiet down for the night, Amanda, Thomas, and Harris made their move. The Internal Affairs office was located deep within the precinct, secured behind locked doors and guarded by the very people they were trying to expose. But Thomas knew the layout of the building, and with his help, they managed to navigate their way through the darkened hallways without drawing attention. The door to the Internal Affairs office loomed before them, its steel frame cold and imposing. Amanda's heart pounded in her chest as Thomas approached the door, his hands trembling slightly as he produced a keycard. He had managed to procure it earlier in the night, though Amanda didn't ask how. With a quiet beep, the door unlocked, and they stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, rows of filing cabinets and computer terminals lining the walls. This was at the heart of the precinct's internal records, the place where years of misconduct had been swept under the rug, hidden away from the public eye. "We need to find everything we can on Reynolds," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper, "and anyone else connected to him." Thomas nodded, moving quickly to one of the computer terminals and typing in a series of commands. Harris stood by the door, keeping watch, his expression tense. Amanda's eyes scanned the room, her mind racing with the possibilities. If they could find the right files, they could blow this whole thing wide open. Minutes ticked by in silence as Thomas worked, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The room was thick with anticipation, every second stretching out as they waited for the system to yield its secrets. And then, finally, Thomas stopped typing. His eyes widened as he stared at the screen, a mixture of shock and disbelief crossing his face. "What is it?" Amanda asked, stepping forward. Thomas hesitated, his voice barely audible as he spoke. "It's worse than we thought." The room was still, save for the soft hum of the computer and the quiet breathing of Amanda, Thomas and Harris. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of what they were about to uncover. Amanda leaned over Thomas' shoulder as he scrolled through the files, her pulse racing with a mix of anticipation and dread. She could already tell from Thomas' expression that what they were looking at was beyond what any of them had expected. "It's all here," Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. Years of complaints against Reynolds, against other officers. Internal investigations that were shut down, evidence buried, witnesses intimidated. This isn't just a few bad cops. This is the whole department. Amanda's stomach tightened. She had suspected as much, but seeing the evidence in front of her, the digital records of cover-ups, of misconduct brushed under the rug, was chilling. The breadth of the corruption was staggering, and it was clear now that Reynolds had been only a small part of a much larger machine. A machine designed to protect itself at all costs. Harris, standing near the door, ran a hand through his hair, his face ashen. He had known about Reynolds, about the rumors, but this was something far more dangerous. He could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every passing second. "We have to take this public," Amanda said, her voice firm but quiet. "All of it. This is our chance to expose the entire network." Thomas looked up from the screen, his eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. "You don't understand, Amanda. If we try to go public with this, we'll be putting targets on our backs. These people, they won't just sit back and let this come out. They'll come after us." "I know the risks," Amanda replied, her voice steady. "But if we don't do something, this will keep happening. Reynolds might be going down, but the rest of them will stay in power, keep doing what they've been doing for years. We can't let that happen." Harris, still by the door, looked conflicted. He had been part of this system for years, had worked alongside many of the people now implicated in the files. He had always prided himself on doing his job the right way, on being one of the good cops. But now he was forced to confront the ugly truth that he had been complicit in a system that was rotting from the inside out. "There's no going back if we do this," Harris said, his voice low. "You need to understand that. If we blow the whistle, it's going to get ugly. And I'm not just talking about the department. These guys have connections, politicians, businessmen, people with real power. If we expose them, we're taking on more than just the police force." Amanda met his gaze, her own filled with determination. "Then we take them all down," she said, "no matter how high up it goes." Harris was silent for a long moment. The gravity of what they were about to do weighed heavily on him, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly afraid. But he also knew Amanda was right. They couldn't turn back now, not after what they had seen. "All right," he said finally, his voice resigned but resolute. "Let's do it." Thomas nodded and began downloading the files onto an external drive. The minutes ticked by in agonizing silence as the files slowly transferred, the weight of their decision settling heavily on all of them. Each of them knew that the moment they left that room, there would be no going back. They would be marked as enemies of the system, as traitors to the very people they had once called colleagues. Just as the last file was copied, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside the door. Amanda's heart skipped a beat, and she glanced at Harris, who immediately tensed. "Someone's coming," he whispered, his voice taut with urgency. Thomas quickly ejected the drive and slipped it into his pocket, just as the door to the room burst open. Two officers stood in the doorway, their eyes narrowing as they took in the scene, the computer still logged into the internal files, Amanda, Thomas, and Harris huddled around it. "What the hell's going on in here?" one of the officers barked, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. Harris stepped forward, his posture tense but controlled. "It's over," he said quietly. "Reynolds is in custody. We're bringing all of this out in the open." The two officers exchanged a look, and Amanda could see the flicker of realization in their eyes. They knew exactly what was happening, and they weren't going to let it happen without a fight. "You're making a big mistake," the second officer said, his voice cold. "You don't know who you're messing with." Amanda's pulse quickened, but she stood her ground. "We know exactly who we're messing with," she said, her voice sharp, "and we're not going to let you keep getting away with it." The first officer stepped forward, his hand now resting fully on his gun. "You think you can just walk out of here with those files? You'll be lucky if you make it to the front door." Harris moved quickly, stepping between the officers and Amanda. "Back off," he said firmly, his voice edged with authority. "This is over. If you want to keep your jobs, you'll walk away now." The room was thick with tension as the two officers stood frozen, weighing their options. Amanda could see the hesitation in their eyes. They were caught between protecting the corrupt system they were a part of and the very real possibility that this was the end of the line. "Let's go," Harris said, motioning to Amanda and Thomas. Without another word, the three of them pushed past the officers, making their way down the dimly lit hallway. Every step felt like a gamble, the possibility of an ambush around each corner looming large in their minds. Amanda's grip tightened on the files in her hand. She knew this was only the beginning. Even if they made it out of the precinct, they would be hunted by the department, by those they were about to expose, by anyone who stood to lose from the revelations they were carrying. They exited the building, the cold night air hitting them like a wall. For a brief moment, Amanda felt the rush of freedom, the sense that they had escaped, but it was fleeting. She knew the hardest part was yet to come. As they reached the street, Harris stopped and turned to Amanda. His face was serious, etched with worry. "You need to get out of here," he said. "Now. Go public with this as soon as you can, but don't stay in one place too long. They'll come after you." Amanda nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "What about you?" Harris shook his head. "I'll deal with what's coming my way. But you need to stay safe. You've got the files. You're the one who can bring them down." Amanda hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Harris gave her a tight nod, his expression grim. "Go," he said. With that, Amanda and Thomas hurried down the street, the weight of the files heavy in their hands. As they rounded the corner, Amanda glanced back at the precinct, at Harris standing alone in the glow of the streetlights. She knew that he had just made the biggest sacrifice of his career, maybe even his life. But they had the files. They had the truth. And now, it was up to them to make sure it saw the light of day. As Amanda and Thomas disappeared into the night, a sense of finality settled over her. The war had only just begun, and the battle lines were clearer than ever. But for the first time, she felt like they had a fighting chance. The truth was out there, and soon enough, the world would know it too. The city seemed quieter than usual as Amanda and Thomas walked quickly down the street, disappearing into the shadows of the tall buildings. The weight of what they had just done was heavy on their shoulders, but there was no time to stop and think. They had to move fast, and they had to make sure the files got into the right hands. Amanda's mind raced. The files they had obtained were damning, far worse than even she had anticipated. Reynolds wasn't just a violent cop, he was a cog in a larger machine of corruption, protected by layers of complicity and silence within the police department and beyond. The deeper they had dug, the more names had come up: officers, supervisors, even city officials. This wasn't just a bad precinct. This was a systemic problem, and now they had the proof. But the question remained, what next? Thomas glanced at Amanda as they turned another corner, their footsteps echoing off the empty streets. "Where do we go?" he asked, his voice low, betraying his exhaustion. Amanda's mind ran through the options. Going to the media seemed like the most obvious choice, but it also came with risks. The media could be manipulated, and the people they were up against had connections everywhere. The files had to go somewhere they couldn't be ignored, somewhere they would create an unstoppable chain reaction. An independent news outlet, Amanda said after a moment. One that can't be bought or influenced, and will send copies to every major legal advocacy group in the country. If we hit them from all sides, they won't be able to shut it down. Thomas nodded, but the tension in his face didn't ease. "You think that'll be enough? These people, they have a lot of power. They won't just let this go." Amanda met his eyes, her own filled with determination. "It's not going to be easy," she admitted, "but we have the truth. And as long as we get the truth out there, we stand a chance." They continued walking in silence, their breath visible in the cold night air. The weight of their decision settled in. There would be no going back. By morning, the city would be a different place. The files would expose years of corruption, and the consequences would ripple far beyond the police department. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She knew how dangerous their opponents were. She knew that exposing this much corruption wouldn't just ruin careers, it would destroy lives. And people like Reynolds, like the ones protecting him, wouldn't hesitate to strike back. As they approached a small, independent media office located in an older part of the city, Amanda felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the number. It was Harris. She answered quickly. "Harris." His voice was strained, and there was static on the line. "Amanda, you need to hurry." "What's happening?" she asked, her pulse quickening. "They know," Harris said, his voice barely audible over the noise in the background. "They know what we did. Someone tipped them off. I don't know how long we have before they come for you, but you need to get the files out now." Amanda's stomach dropped. "What about you?" There was a long pause, and then Harris spoke again, his voice quiet. "Don't worry about me. Just do what you need to do." Before Amanda could respond, the line went dead. She stood frozen for a moment, the weight of Harris' words sinking in. He had stayed behind to buy them time, to take the heat off of them, knowing full well the danger he was in. "We have to move," Amanda said, turning to Thomas, her voice urgent. "They're coming for us. We don't have much time." They entered the media office, greeted by the flickering fluorescent lights and the sound of an old printer humming in the corner. The office was small, cluttered with papers and outdated equipment, but it was exactly what they needed off the radar, a place where the files could be uploaded and disseminated before anyone could stop them. The journalist they had contacted, a sharp-eyed woman in her mid-40s named Laura, greeted them with a cautious smile. "You've got the files?" she asked, already typing furiously on her computer. Amanda nodded and handed over the USB drive. "This is it. Everything you need to blow this thing wide open. You need to get it out there, and fast." Laura didn't ask any questions. She plugged in the drive and began uploading the files to secure servers, her fingers flying over the keyboard. Amanda and Thomas stood by, the tension in the room palpable. Every second felt like a countdown, like they were racing against an invisible clock. "Once this goes live," Laura said, her voice steady, "there's no stopping it. We're talking about hundreds of people implicated. The city won't be able to ignore this. good, Amanda said, though her chest was tight with anxiety. This was it, the moment they had been building toward all night. As the files finished uploading, Laura leaned back in her chair and looked at them. It's done, she said. We'll send copies to every major news outlet and legal advocacy group. By tomorrow morning, this city's going to explode. Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It was done. The files were out. The truth was going to be exposed, and there was no way to take it back. But even as the relief washed over her, she knew the hardest part was still to come. They left the media office just before dawn, the city bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. Amanda and Thomas walked in silence, the weight of the night's events hanging heavy over them. They had done it. They had exposed the corruption, but now they had to face the fallout. As they reached the end of the street, Amanda's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message, a single, short text from an unknown number. You're not safe. Leave the city. Now. Amanda stared at the message, her mind racing. It was a warning, and she knew better than to ignore it. Whoever had sent it knew what they were up against, and now, so did she. We have to go, Amanda said, her voice firm. Thomas looked at her, confusion crossing his face. What? Go where? Out of the city, Amanda replied, her eyes scanning the streets around them. They're not going to let us stay. We have to disappear at least until this blows over. Thomas hesitated, but the look in Amanda's eyes convinced him. He nodded, understanding.